couple weeks ago, Microsoft finally made it official. Halo 4 comes out worldwide on November 6th of this year. Here in the United States, this raised a few eyebrows in the media and among culture watchers, as big pop culture events generally aren't scheduled for November the 6th here because that's traditionally the day of our presidential election. In addition to noting that it was perhaps somewhat, well, tacky for the timing to intentionally or not imply that buying the new Halo game was an event deserving of equal importance to selecting the leader of a global superpower, a lot of folks, myself included, immediately made the calculation that the prospect of sharing the spotlight with the return of Master Chief was potentially good news for one candidate and potentially bad news for another. And since this was the internet, the second biggest breeding ground for conspiracy theories, outside of isolated, well-armed cabins in the Montana wilderness, imaginings of a nefarious conspiracy being at work quickly took shape, namely alleging that Halo 4 was being released at the same time as the election in order to drive down the youth vote and thus elect presumptive Republican nominee Mitt Romney president. There were similar conspiracy theories claiming it was supposed to work out for Barack Obama, but for reasons that will soon be demonstrated, they were not nearly as popular. Naturally, that sounds more than a little ridiculous, but like most conspiracy theories, it contains a certain sliver of remote possibility. The video game industry is more financially powerful than ever, financially powerful corporations have a stronger interest in politics than ever, and the notion of staging distractions in order to drive voter turnout among certain demographics up or down is an unpleasant reality of modern politics. By contrast, simply giving a whole bunch of potential voters something much more fun to do than a boring old election would be a relatively simple and totally legal way to manipulate turnout, at least in theory. Hollywood movie studios have recently begun to claim that major game releases have become large enough to actually compete for audience attention with their product, so it's not that much of a stretch to imagine Washington having the same worries. And while I didn't exactly see it as being terribly likely scenario, its implications were interesting and seemed important enough that I was genuinely surprised to not see much interest of it from the gaming press. And so, selfless, dedicated, quasi-journalist that I am, I opted to investigate the matter and see if I could find anything out one way or another. The immediate question to ask is how the alleged scenario is supposed to play out. In the interest of time, here's the basic idea. In 2012, there's going to be two guys running for president of the United States, incumbent Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. Most political analysts agree that said election is going to be extremely divisive. With very little middle ground and lots of voters having made up their minds far in advance. In other words, campaigning for both men is assumed to be less focused on winning over new votes than making sure as many people who've already made up their minds to vote for them as possible actually go out and do it. Since in American elections, the citizens are not required to vote and combined turnout rarely climbs above 60% of the eligible population. When Barack Obama won in 2008, part of the key to his electoral victory was having a very decisive 66% lead among the so-called youth vote, i.e. voters aged 18 to 30, which is, of course, also the target audience for Halo 4. So, yeah, it's pretty basic conspiracy theory mathematics. If enough young voters are too busy waiting in line to buy or hurrying home to play Halo 4 to bother voting that day, it could negatively impact the candidate they were most likely to vote for, in this case being Mr. Obama. Of course, this only makes sense if you could offer some proof that Microsoft, who would have made the final decision as to when and how to release the game, would want to help the Romney campaign in the first place. So the question becomes, are there any connections between Romney and Microsoft? Well, I went looking and yes, there are. According to the First Street Research Group, Microsoft, quote, leads the pack among corporations with direct connections to the Romney campaign through advisors, bundlers, and contributors who are or have also been lobbyists for the company. That does not exactly sound good. However, a lot of the suspiciousness of it starts to dissipate somewhat if you take note that when Microsoft gives out actual money to candidates in the form of direct campaign contributions, it tends to spread the wealth among both parties. And while the company consistently gives more to Republicans, the individual politician who got the most Microsoft financial support by far between 2011 and the present was, in fact, President Obama. For the record, I contacted both the Obama and Romney campaigns for a comment about the Halo 4 Election Day controversy, but thus far have received no response from either organization. I also contacted Microsoft, who said through their spokesperson that the November 6th date was purely coincidental. And of course, it's vital to point out that this is a worldwide release date, not just for the United States. So, yeah. As such, at this point, my conclusion, based on the facts at hand, is that the conspiracy theory of Halo 4 being released on Election Day in an attempt to influence said election in one day or another is pretty damn unlikely. However, actually looking at the numbers and trends did convince me that the idea of manipulating voter turnout by staging a mass media event like a major game release as a demographic distraction could conceivably work, especially when you consider that digital distribution is becoming much more commonplace, while voting remains a time-consuming activity requiring scheduling and travel for the majority of its participants. And I'll be honest, that's kind of a scary prospect, regardless of what your individual politics may or may not be. So, while I didn't find any real evidence of a sinister Halo conspiracy, I did find cause to opine that now more than ever, gamers and the media consuming culture in general have a responsibility to remain engaged in the world outside their respective fixations. Gaming is about fantasy, yes, but fantasy shouldn't come at the expense of our ability to recognize the more important things going on around us in the real world. And it definitely shouldn't leave us susceptible to people who would use that fantasy to make us less involved in decisions that could affect our very lives. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.